What's going on, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Get Over Yourself podcast. My name is Brandon Davis, the host of the show, and I am going to be sharing a couple strategies I would use if I was starting brand spanking new on a company, any sort of startup that you're interested in getting into, how I would operate it at a very, very low cost so you're not burning a ton of money on an idea that you don't even know if it's going to succeed yet. One of the number one reasons startups fail is because they lack of funds to continue going. Eventually, as a founder, you do need to pay yourself because lo and behold, you have to pay for your rent, your groceries, and everything else inside of your life. So, in today's episode, I want to break some of those concepts down, how you can get an early MVP out to the public to make sure, once again, your idea is validated and people are actually going to buy it. And then once you have a succeeded MVP version that you know people are actually going to purchase, how you can kind of release it out into the public realm without having to spend a ton on upfront capital. So if you fit that boat, you are a young founder trying to figure out how to get your startup off the ground, see if it's actually applicable to your audience, and you want to do it on a cheap budget, this episode's for you. So with that being said, let's jump into today's episode. Okay, first and foremost, I want to speak on starting your product out with an MVP. I have so many people ever since Interval's taken off, and I'm graduating here in April from my local university, Brigham Young University, and I have so many people come up to me all the time now and ask me how and what were the steps of getting Interval off the ground. Where did we come up with the idea? How did we validate it? And the short and simple answer is we had 40,000 other ideas beforehand that absolutely sucked or failed in some fashion or form. And I was just chatting with a guy a couple days ago, and he asked to speak with me for 10 minutes and pick my brain a little bit. And so he came over to our office, and I sat down with him, and I was like, "Okay, Isaac, what do you want to talk about?" And his main concern was, "Look, I really want to start a business. I feel like I'd be good at it. I just don't really have that burning idea inside of my head yet." And I started laughing. He goes, "Well, what's going on?" And I said, "Every single person struggles with that at some point in their life, especially if you're a young founder. Because let's face it, as young founders, you don't always have the expertise. You haven't worked in a certain industry for the past 20, 25 years. You don't have as much knowledge in most aspects as somebody who's been in their career for a long time. I've done other episodes in the past where I think that's actually a very strong advantage. But in specifically Isaac's case, he had little semblances of ideas, but he didn't have like a general scope of where he wanted to take it. He had little pieces of the puzzle, but not the full entire set. And he couldn't piece them together yet. And so he asked me where Interval started. How did we come up with the idea? What was our early traction like, and things like that. And I kind of broke him through down a process that myself and my co-founder Connor and I went through of where Interval was. And I'm not going to share every single little detail inside of our entire grand scope of the Interval journey. But one thing that I shared with him, and I'm pulling up my phone here so I could just walk him through. I sent this over afterwards so he could have a decent understanding of our entire process. A lot of times people see these overnight success businesses and that's what they glue to and they think they're able to do it. And I think social media pushes a narrative that it's very easy to start running a business within 5 minutes. Nowadays, I think it is easier than it was even 10 years ago, but that is not always the case to just immediately have success. So real quick, if you're one of these founders who thinks you have a semblance of an idea, you don't even know where to get started, but you do want to start a business, this is a little bit of our journey. Heck, some of these ideas actually aren't horrible still, and I think they're actually applicable in some cases. Maybe you could steal one of mine. These are a couple I would go with. The first, these are some of our pivots before we got to where Interval is at today. Original idea Connor and I worked on. We called it Venue. It was the Airbnb for wedding venues. It allowed regular venues to host on our platform and also allow people to rent out their backyards or other properties, like a barn or things like that for weddings and other venue needs. The problem we saw, the market wasn't massive. It wasn't a super investable market, and we knew that we wanted to take investment capital to grow very quickly. And then a couple of the major reasons that we had against it, Airbnb already had some wedding platforms and they're testing that market out. They're obviously the big name in the game. It would be hard to compete. Secondly, a lot of neighbors would get super, super angry. We ran tests with this where people would do little venue events inside of their backyards and people would run tests, and neighbors would not like when cars will be blocking their street literally every weekend if you're hosting things at your house in your backyard for these weddings. So the public concern was very a big problem. And then lastly, liquor licensing laws. Every single wedding has liquor at it for the most part. And a lot of these places couldn't support that because it was in their backyard and things like that. So once again, I'm just going to jump through a lot of these very quickly. Next, we started Lecturefy. It was an automated note taker for college lectures. We've actually seen a ton of these pop up on the market recently where students, all you do is hit record while you're in your classes. It'll write notes, create study guides and quizzes, and even practice quizzes and other little learning materials. So you can just basically pay attention to your professor and not have to worry about any of the other tasks. And you could actually just sit there and learn. We actually had over 70 students beta testing this with us, but the large issue we learned is college students aren't really willing to pay for any software subscriptions that aren't Netflix or any other cost besides rent and running to McDonald's on the weekend. So we did spend a little bit of time. We pumped out an MVP very quickly. We had early traction, which was a good sign, but our users came back and said we aren't willing to pay for it. We only had a couple people using it and paying at the time. Third idea was a home investor. Basically picture, long story short on this one, basically picture Robinhood, but for home investing. So people who don't have hundreds of thousands of dollars to go put into the real estate market, they could buy partial shares into a home as it grows in equity. I still think this one has great potential. There's a couple larger competitors in space. One is already backed by Jeff Bezos, which was one of our concerns, not necessarily a huge concern because you could still grow inside of that space. But Connor and myself, we just realized we are not the founders for this idea. Another idea we had was Dasher. This was basically a marketplace to connect with local businesses and political campaigns so they can spread their messages. Picture a local new restaurant that serves sushi. They could offer some kind of discount to new customers, 50% off if they brought the flyer in, or politicians if they want to do little door hangers saying vote for XYZ politician. Our idea was to connect them with a Dasher where they would go and basically just walk around town hanging up flyers in specific areas at the restaurant where the politicians wanted them to hang flyers. People do this all the time for their businesses already. We thought we would just connect them with somebody to do it on a more permanent basis. Massive issues we learned very early on were a lot of these businesses couldn't have a good way of actually getting in contact with their Dashers. There's a really hard way to actually prove that they were doing their job and actually doing the door hangers and putting flyers on people's doors and in their mailboxes and such. And then lastly, getting them the materials. So if I had to drive all the way into town to go and get the materials of the flyers or whatever it was from the restaurant or the politician, and then I'd have to drive on the complete opposite side of town to go and actually hang them up on people's doors, just wasn't super feasible. Wasn't an industry we wanted to get our hands in. Anyways, very long story short, we had a lot of different ideas going, and it took us a long time to actually stumble upon Interval, where we're at now, where we handle the automated debt collection process for businesses. If you're new to this channel, basically our startup, what it does is if you're a business owner who has customers who owe you money, you plug them into our software. We handle the entire outreach process as well as collection. And it's kind of more data centric platform. Picture a traditional collection agency, but everything's data driven and on the software side. So we pass all the cost savings and we actually can collect a little bit more than most industry standards for collection agencies themselves. So we went through a very long journey to actually get here. Connor and I worked for quite a long time without paying ourselves, banging our heads against the wall, going back to the whiteboard and trying every little idea. It eventually led us here, and I'm grateful for every single step along the process because that's what got us to the success we're seeing right now in Interval. But like I mentioned, I think on social media and just on the outside perspective, you see these overnight successes and people make it seem like it's very, very easy to find the grand idea. But that is not the case 99% of the time. And so if you're one of these founders that is struggling coming up with your big next grand business idea, it's okay. One of them will come to you. And my biggest piece of advice is making sure that you're talking with people whose pains you're trying to solve. Find an industry that you're actually interested in working in and go and solve their issues. For instance, you can go shadow a dentist and figure out what their biggest pains inside their practices are. Go shadow a bank teller and see what their biggest pains are. Go and talk to a local guy from your church and maybe he's a business owner. Ask him what he struggles with. You're never really going to find any ideas. You can. I think so many people do it this way now where they just sit online and they hope that the ideas are going to come to them as they're doing the doom scroll on TikTok and Instagram. Go out in your community, talk to business owners and figure out what their problems are. See if that problem that you come up with one business owner is replicable across the industry. If it is, make an early MVP. And that's what I want to jump into right now. So MVPs, for anyone who doesn't know, it is minimum viable product. It is basically the earliest of early versions of your product where you can get some kind of semblance, put it in the hands of your customers and see if they actually like what they're seeing. An MVP with an early product might be, for instance, in the office space right next to me, we have a gym shoe company named Otishi. They have this barefoot shoe where it's machine washable. There's a zero drop. It has a wide toe box, and they sell it to gym goers. So a lot of times at your local gyms, you might see somebody wearing socks when they're doing deadlifts or other lifting types. It's because they want that good grip on the ground, and a lot of shoes don't offer the support that they need. So they went out and they solved this. But their very, very early shoe was horrendous. It was poorly stitched together. The colors were way off. It wasn't the most comfy shoe, but they got the concept out there because their customers needed to see what it was like. And so, even though it wasn't the end all be all of the shoe, and they've now, I think they're on version number 3 now, and they still are going to, just like Nike did in the early days, they're still going to improve their product 10, 5, 15, 50 times over the course of the lifetime of their business. They went out and they showed their early users, their early adopters, what the product was, and they got market feedback and validation. They started making sales, even though it wasn't the perfect product. They started selling it for a decent price. They got gym goers to get interested in it, started growing their brand awareness on social media, and kind of the rest is history. Last year alone, after being in business for, I want to say, just over a year, they did $1 million. Just absolutely amazing story. Perfect example of getting your MVP out there. For somebody like me on the software side of things, if you want to get an early MVP, there's a couple different tools you can look into. There's no code tools. You can throw your idea into ChatGPT and give it a little bit of a semblance of an idea, and then throw it into a code studio where you can push the idea very quickly. It's not going to really work, obviously, just by getting text generated by ChatGPT or Replit or things like that, but you can get an early understanding of it. Another great one is using Figma. You can get a friend who has design skills. You can go on YouTube and learn Figma yourself. On Figma, you can kind of create a mock-up of a dashboard and say, all right, this is what happens when you click here and you do this process, and you can walk your customer through the entire journey. Obviously, once again, the product won't work, but it'll give them an idea. And you can actually put that product, even if it is software, in the hands and eyes of your potential customers and see how they interact with the entire thing. That is the perfect way to get started. If you start pumping out all these different ideas and businesses and you don't actually have an MVP where you can show early users, the massive issue that I see with a lot of the young students around me who are starting businesses is they don't have an early MVP. So they go and build something that they hope somebody's actually interested in, but then turns out that person wasn't interested. And so they wasted all this time on something that they could have learned if they just pumped out an MVP that should take hopefully less than a couple weeks to put out there. And then they go get that validation that comes with it. Validation is the next step I want to speak about. Validation is probably one of the most important steps, if not the most important step in starting your business. If you don't have something that people want to purchase, you do not have a business. So when you go out and, like I was mentioning, you can go shadow somebody, you can go talk to your business, your family's business friends, any connections you have, and find out what problems they solve. Go out and find their willingness to pay and actually validate that they're willing to put some kind of buy-in for your product. A great way that I've seen this in the industry is people will actually go out and get paying users before the product is actually built. It's like an upfront cost. Picture you go out and you're putting a new pool inside of your home. Even though the pool isn't in your home for months and months and months, you put with the pool development company, you give them a 50% deposit upfront because that's locking you in to saying, I want you to build this pool. You can do the exact same thing with physical products or software. Go in front of your early adopters, your ideal customers, and say, hey, this is what I'm building. We're actually working on it right now. How much will you pay me to be one of our first users? You would be amazed at how many people can get early traction that way. And if you have nobody saying that they would pay for that, that's your sign that, once again, you don't have a business. So let's assume that you got through the MVP stage, you validated everything, you got your semblance of an idea. Let's say you even got past all the pivoting that I mentioned earlier that we had to do before we stumbled upon Interval. Let's say you got to that point, and here you are. You're ready to start going full force on product development so you can actually start growing the business, start selling it more, hire out more staff members to grow the team, and you're in this road. And this is the stage Interval's at right now. So I'm speaking directly from personal opinion and examples here. How are you going to fund your startup? Especially, once again, this episode is focused on the young entrepreneur, the person who is trying to get a business off the ground. How are you going to fund it? Sure, you can use for a couple months, you can exacerbate any kind of savings you have. There's always the option of working the day job and you working on your startup at night. Obviously, that requires a lot more hours of work total, and you're not going to have your full dedicated mind set forward on just your startup alone. There's a couple different options there. You can go move back in with a family member if you have parents, an aunt, or an uncle who really love you and they're okay with you grinding out this idea, prove to them that it's actually going to be worth it, give them some sort of buy-in there. But my biggest recommendation, if you're trying to do this on a budget, number one, and number two, you really want to grow your business in a quick light. My number one piece of advice is go out and find local pitch competitions from either universities in your hometown or businesses who are sponsoring pitch competitions for your ideas. So many young entrepreneurs don't even understand the benefit of going to pitch competitions. On our earliest days of Interval, we were applying to pitch competitions probably 3 per week on a high end, and I would say at least 1 per week on a low end. So we'll call the average maybe 2 per week. We were applying to pitch competitions across the entire United States, and I think even globally. We applied to one in Canada. We didn't get in because it turned out you had to be a Canadian citizen. But the point stands. There are pitch competitions across the entire US that will literally give you funding simply to work on the idea that you're validating. Now, there's a caveat. Some of these competitions, there's certain requirements. Maybe your business has to do revenue. Maybe you have to not have done revenue. Maybe certain team members have to be going to a university, or you have to hit X, Y, or Z check mark on your racial background or things like that. Go and search up local competitions as well as competitions around the United States. Make sure you're eligible to compete in those competitions, and they literally will give you grants to start working on your business. We probably got, I should have ran the numbers before I started recording this episode. I want to say Interval's probably gotten over maybe around $45,000 on early traction grants that we do not have to pay back in these competitions, simply because there was some person, a judge or somebody in the audience who wanted Interval to succeed. And so they voted for us to win some cash. We have done this across various different competitions now, and it was what fueled us. So Connor and I could keep working. We could pay our software costs that went into building out the product, and we could basically have living costs where we weren't starving every single week to keep working on Interval. I'm not saying this is the end all be all. This is definitely not a great growth strategy for the long-term experience. The best growth strategy always is going to get paying customers. But when you're launching, you've just gotten past this MVP stage and you're ready to start growing this business up, it's no lie or deceit. You will need money to actually make the business work. Do it on a budget, do it as friendly as you possibly can, but you will need funds. So my challenge for you today, after you find the validation, after you've spoken to the business owners and you have validated an idea, after you get an early MVP out there and you prove that people are actually willing to pay for that idea, the next step is when you start jumping into the actual product development and you start pushing out whatever you're working on for your paying users. Find a couple pitch competitions you can apply to, even if it's $1,000. You can get out there and win free grants for your business so you can continue driving the growth and hopefully build out the product to the stage where you can get those early adopters and get more traction and grow and grow and grow. Guys, we use this strategy for Interval. It's what kept Connor and I in business for a lot longer than we probably should have been at the very early stage. That's what got us to our first fundraise, as well as growing out the team right now. Steal our strategy. I promise you, it is not a long-term growth strategy, but for the early stage of a business, steal our strategy. I promise you, it'll get you off the ground. We have lived it. And if you have any questions, feel free as always to send me a message on social media or shoot me an email at llcgetoveryourself@gmail.com. Guys, I appreciate you for listening to today's episode of Get Over Yourself podcast. We're going to be kicking it back into the format of bi-weekly episodes once again up until around the middle of April. Interval is kicking off right now, and there's a lot of things crashing at this very moment in time. With my college graduation coming up, Interval growing, trying to run this podcast, trying to be somewhat of a healthy student, maintain my marriage. There's a lot of things going on in life right now. So long story short, we're going to still be doing the bi-weekly episodes up at least until April. Come back next week where we're going to have a guest interview that you can be very excited for, and we'll see you then.